They don't necessarily correspond with the sections in the textbook. The first part is, as I said, this is actually something theoretically you should know from last year, which is adding fractions. The big focus in this chapter in grade 8 is multiplying fractions and dividing fractions. We started by doing multiplying by a whole number and dividing by a whole number, and then we worked on just multiplying fractions and dividing fractions, or mixed numbers. When I say fractions, I mean any kind of fraction. All right? If we're looking to make this, to figure out what this is here, the best thing to do is make a common denominator first. I personally think it's best to work down the page, but you can work across if you want. I'm going to move this one up here, just so I can work down the page. Working down the page means I can write all my steps underneath the one before it. If I was going to work this one out here, I would change the first fraction to 4/6 and leave this as 5/6, and you get that this is 9/6. 9/6 you can actually reduce. You can make it 3/2 if you want. You make a common denominator, change that first fraction. Second question here. I know I messed myself up there. Thank you though. Guys, the best strategy is to change any mixed numbers into improper fractions. Sometimes you can answer the questions while they're in mixed numbers, but it's easier if you do them in as improper fractions. So I would change this one to 7/4 plus 5/3. You need to make a common denominator when you're adding fractions. Move that out of the way. If you're making a common denominator there, what's the common denominator? Fourths and thirds, you got to make it 12. This is going to be 21. This is going to be 20. You get 41 over 12. If you really want to, you can give it as a mixed number. You could say it's 3 and 5/12, but either one of those is fine. Okay? The multiplying ones. Let's move the dividing ones out of the way here first. The two multiplying ones are you're multiplying by a whole number. If you're multiplying, I think a lot of you have learned that you can just multiply those top numbers. And you can write right away that this is 12/5. I would just leave it like that, but you can change it again if you want. If you're given a mixed number, I think it's easier to change it to a improper fraction first. That's 7/4. So this is going to give you 42/4. Or you could reduce that 21/2, or you could make it 10 1/2. Any one of those answers is fine. It's probably best if you reduce it at least to this first. When you're dividing by a fraction, you notice how up here you multiply the top numbers? Here you divide the top numbers. If you divide the top numbers, the problem is those don't divide nicely. A good strategy is to change them so that they do divide nicely. Change the first one into 12/15 because now I have a number I can divide, right? That didn't divide nicely, but this does. Why does the second set of numbers divide nicely?
Because the first set of numbers is not common denominator.
They're not. These don't work, right? Well, I mean, I guess after I asked that question, I realized the answer to that question is because they don't divide nicely. I mean, the reason they don't divide nicely is they don't divide nicely. If you're given one that's this, right? Okay. If you're given one that's like this, 2 2/3, change it to a mixed number first. Okay? Or no, change it to an improper fraction first. This is 8/3 divided by 4. What does that give you? What does it give you? What does it give you?
8 over 12.
It actually, remember, when you... you need to look at what those divide to first. Okay? That gives you 8 divided by 4 gives you 2/3, right? If you have 8/3 and you divide it by 4, you have 2/3. Let's get this moving a little more quickly here. I know some of you have reached the end of your attention span, which is fine. You can always work on something by yourself, right? For multiplying is the one you do not use a common denominator. Okay? Don't just change these to a common denominator because you think you remembered something about a common denominator. What you can do is you can just multiply the top numbers and multiply the bottom numbers. You'll get 12 out of 21, but you'll be able to reduce that. You'll be able to reduce that to 4/7. You can figure out ahead of time, you'll be able to reduce that. This is how you can figure it out. If you see that this is a 6 and this is a 3, if you can divide them both by the same thing, what can you divide those both by? This is kind of tricky stuff that not everybody learns in grade 8, but what can you divide both those numbers by? 6 and 3? You can divide them both by 3, right? If you see you can divide them both by 3, just divide them both by 3 ahead of time. Rather than waiting to here to divide them, it's easier to make them smaller before you multiply it out. If you divide this by 3, you get 2. If you divide this by 3, you get 1. Because then all you have to do is say 2 times 2 gives me the 4 right away, and 1 times 7 gives me the 7 right away. That's the answer, 4/7. This one, I hope we've got by now. What should we do with that? What should we change it to? What should we change it to? Let's have someone different answer. What should we do? Exactly. Change them into improper fractions. That's 5/2. This is 10/3. I think that's easier because now all you have to do again is multiply the tops, multiply the bottoms. You could say that the answer is 50 over what?
Over 6.
Over 6. Which is actually 25 over 3. If the original question had mixed numbers, probably how should you answer the question? If the original question had mixed numbers, what's the best way to answer the question? If someone asks you a question in French, what's the best way to answer the question?
In French.
In French? If someone asks you in Italian, what's the best way to answer?
In Spanish.
In Italian? The best way is to say 8 and 1/3. I want you guys to realize right now, can you see from these numbers here, the 2, whoops, can you see from the 2 and the 3 here, this 2, this 3, and the 1/2 and 1/3, there's no way you're getting these numbers by starting with the question the way it is. Please don't just try and say, oh, 2 times 3 is 6, and 1/2 times 1/3 is 1/6. It's not that. Don't just try to do the whole numbers and the fractions separately or something like that. It's not going to work, okay? It's not going to work for a lot of reasons. If you wanted to be tricky with this, once you've changed it to this, you could look and say, I have a 10 here and I have a 2 here, and both of those can be divided by how much? What can you divide both those by? 10 and 2, what is a number you can divide both of those by? No, what can you divide them both by? A smaller number you can divide them both by. 2. You can divide them both by 2. Okay, don't lose sight of this now. What did we have to divide by to go from here to here? To go from 50 over 6 to that, what did we have to divide by? If you want to make it easier to work with the numbers, you can notice that the fact that you have a 10 and a 2, you can divide them both by 2. If you divide the 2 by 2, you get 1. If you divide the 10 by 2, you get 5. Then all you have to do is multiply the numbers that happen to be smaller, right? 5 and 5, 1 and 3. That gives you this answer right away, this one over here. Okay, it gives you 25 over 3 right away. Last ones here, the dividing ones. Let's move those so where we have some more room here. This should be a pretty quick one. 4/5 divided by 1/5. You're saying how many of these fit into there? How many 1/5 fit into 4/5? It's 4. If the bottom numbers are the same, you can just divide the top numbers. If the bottom numbers are not the same, you can do one of two things here. You can change the question so that the bottom numbers are the same. Like for this one here, what could you change the 5/6 into? 5/6 we could change into something twelfths, right? 10/12 divided by 5/12. If you have 10/12 divided by 5/12, then you can just divide the two numbers. What is it? It's actually just 2, right? It's just 2. It's not 2/12, it's just 2. Okay? You notice up here it wasn't 4/5, it was just 4, right? Think about it visually. If you have 4/5 of something, which we're going to draw by a rectangle, here's something, and here's 4/5 of that something. There's 4/5 shaded. This question is saying, how many 1/5 fit into 4/5? Here's 1/5. Here's another 1/5. How many of them am I shading in? Just 4, right? There's 4 that fit in there. I can count 4 in there. If I want to know how many 5/12 fit into 10/12, it's 2. It's not 2/12. Basically, you can think about it as divide the top numbers and divide the bottom numbers. What about the last one here? We've got it by now. If you got a mixed number, what should you probably do with it? So we've got our couple people. Anybody else want to take a stab at this? Anybody else who hasn't said anything? Yes? Change it into an improper fraction. That divided by this. Is this convenient to divide now? Are these numbers convenient to divide? Look at the numbers on top. Number 1, these aren't the same, right? You got to make those the same. If you want to make these the same, can you make the first one so that it has ninths, or do we have to change both of them? Yeah, you only have to change the first one, because if I change the first one, I can times the top and the bottom by 3, and what am I going to get here? 15 ninths. Now this doesn't work out nicely. 15 divided by 2 doesn't work out nicely. What it is whatever 15 divided by 2 is, you can just write like this. You can write it as a fraction. 15 divided by 2 is 15 halves. Just write the answer like that. If it doesn't work out nicely, just write those, divide those. 15 divided by 2, 15 over 2. You can make that 7.5. 15 divided by 2, when you were a little kid and you were learning to divide, you'd say this fits in, there's 7, and there's 1 left over out of 2. Okay? 13 minutes. I realize, again, this is beyond some of our attention span, but maybe we're getting better, most of us. For the whole, most of us are getting better. Can we get going on that last section in the study guide? The last section you need to ask questions about. I'm going to assume you're okay with these 5 operations. The last section is 2 things. It's solving problems involving fractions, and it's order of operations. Look at the examples, ask questions, okay?